I am Julian. I am 32 years old, and exactly 1 month ago, I found myself standing in a crowded Boston courtroom, being aggressively sued by my own parents for allegedly stealing my $12 million inheritance. For my entire life, they treated me like an absolute ghost, a burden they were forced to carry. But the very second my grandfather passed away and left his entire estate to me, they suddenly remembered they had a second son. They dragged me into court, attempting to destroy my career, my reputation, and my sanity. While I was standing there, still deeply mourning the only man who ever truly loved me, my mother looked at me from across the plaintiff's table, rolled her eyes in front of dozens of reporters, and loudly whispered to her attorney that I was a mistake they should have fixed a long time ago. They wanted to humiliate me publicly and strip me of everything. But there was one major thing my parents did not know. They had absolutely no idea about the secret weapon my grandfather had quietly left behind. A digital ghost waiting in the shadows to deliver absolute justice from beyond the grave. And right now, because of that secret, they are the ones facing total financial and social ruin, begging me for a mercy they never once showed me. Before I tell you exactly how I completely destroyed their false narrative in front of a packed courtroom, please hit that like button if you truly believe that toxic family members deserve exactly what comes to them. And do not forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Your support is the greatest motivation for me. Now, let us go back to where this entire nightmare really started. The courtroom was incredibly suffocating. It was a massive, intimidating space that smelled distinctly of cheap lemon floor wax, old paper, and the expensive, overpowering cologne worn by the men who usually won in rooms like this. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the room had swung open an hour prior to allow the public and the local press inside. What should have been a private, quiet family inheritance dispute had been intentionally transformed into a local media circus. My parents wanted an audience for my execution. My mother, Beatrice, sat at the plaintiff's table. She was wearing a tailored, navy blue designer suit that probably cost more than my very first car. Her hair was styled perfectly, and her makeup was done to make her look slightly pale, slightly tired. She was playing the role of the grieving, betrayed daughter-in-law to absolute perfection. Beside her sat my father, Victor. His jaw was tightly clenched, his posture as rigid as a stone pillar. He wore his power suit, the one he wore when he was closing massive real estate deals. They did not look at me. Even now, in a room where we were the main event, they looked entirely through me, exactly as they had done my entire life. Their high-priced attorney, a slick, silver-haired man named Winston, was busy shuffling legal pads and whispering in my father's ear with a smug, self-satisfied grin on his face. Winston was known in the city for being ruthless. He had already leaked a fabricated, highly damaging story to the press earlier that week. He had painted me as a manipulative, greedy corporate lawyer who had swooped in during my grandfather's final days of alleged dementia to maliciously rewrite the will and steal the family fortune. They wanted to completely humiliate me publicly and taint the jury pool before the trial even officially began. They wanted to make sure my career was dead, regardless of the verdict. I sat quietly at the defense table, my hands resting flat on the cool, polished wood of the table. My attorney, Clara, sat next to me. She was a brilliant legal mind, currently reviewing our massive stacks of files. I had spent years of my life building my reputation as a highly respected corporate attorney in Boston. I had worked brutal 80-hour weeks, paid off my own massive student loans without a dime of their help, and fought tooth and nail for every single ounce of respect I had earned in this city. I earned my salary through blood, sweat, and tears. And now, the two people who shared my DNA were trying to burn my entire life to the ground over money they did not earn, did not need, and did not deserve. The bailiff, a large man with a booming voice, suddenly called the noisy room to order. All rise for the Honorable Judge Montgomery. The room collectively stood as Judge Montgomery stepped up to the bench. He was an imposing, older man with sharp eyes, graying hair, and a well-known reputation for having zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics. Years ago, when I was just a junior associate fresh out of law school and terrified of making a mistake, He had mentored me on a massively complex real estate litigation case. He was tough, fair, and incredibly intelligent. He settled heavily into his large leather chair, adjusted his reading glasses on the bridge of his nose, and opened the thick case file resting in front of him. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above us. Judge Montgomery read the names of the plaintiffs aloud. Victor and Beatrice Sullivan. Then, his eyes moved slowly down the page to the name of the defendant. He paused. The silence stretched. A deep, prominent furrow formed between his gray brows. He looked up, his eyes scanning the large room. He looked past the reporters, past the gallery, past my parents, and past their slick attorney, until his gaze finally landed directly on me. He lowered his glasses slowly. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice echoing loudly off the wood-paneled walls, laced with genuine disbelief. "Julian, you are the defendant in this matter." I stood up straight, buttoning my suit jacket, forcing my voice to remain perfectly calm and steady despite the adrenaline rushing through my veins. "Yes, Your Honor, I am." He stared at me for a long, incredibly heavy moment. The confusion on his face was palpable to everyone in the room. He knew me. He knew my work ethic, my integrity, and my flawless track record in the legal community. He was visibly trying to reconcile the highly respected attorney he knew with the vicious, disgusting allegations of elder abuse and fraud written in the complaint before him. My mother scoffed audibly, crossing her arms over her chest. She thought she had already won. She thought the legal system was just another exclusive country club she could buy her way into with the right attorney and the right amount of tears. To understand why she looked at me like I was absolute dirt beneath her shoes in a court of law, to understand how a family could become this toxic and broken, you have to understand how this family operated behind closed doors for decades. You have to understand what it truly means to be the invisible child in a house that is entirely obsessed with image, status, and wealth. I learned that I was completely worthless to my parents on a rainy Tuesday evening in late October. I was turning 10 years old. For weeks, I had been eagerly looking forward to my birthday. I had saved up a few dollars from my tiny allowance and walked in the rain to the local discount store to buy my own decorations. I bought cheap crepe paper streamers, a flimsy plastic banner that said "Happy Birthday" in bright, primary colors, and a small pack of balloons. After school, I spent 2 entire hours hanging them in the formal dining room, taping the banner crookedly across the large bay window. I set out paper plates, carefully folded napkins, and sat down to wait. By 6 o'clock that evening, the house was a whirlwind of absolute chaos, but absolutely none of it was for me. My father, Victor, paced the grand hallway with his phone pressed hard to his ear, shouting aggressively at someone about a delayed real estate closing and threatening a massive lawsuit. He walked past the dining room 3 separate times, completely ignoring the decorations I had spent hours putting up. My mother, Beatrice, was frantically pacing the kitchen, screaming at a luxury catering company over the phone. My older brother, Harrison, had just received his acceptance letter to a mid-tier, incredibly average state college. To my parents, this was the equivalent of winning a Nobel Prize. They were hosting a massive networking dinner that weekend to celebrate Harrison's monumental academic achievement, inviting all their wealthy friends, local politicians, and potential business partners. I sat completely alone at the long, cold mahogany dining table. In front of me was a single, plastic-wrapped cupcake I had quietly taken from the pantry so I wouldn't starve. The silence in that dining room was deafening. It was the heavy, suffocating, world-shattering silence of a 10-year-old boy realizing that he simply does not matter to the people who are supposed to love and protect him. Around 7 o'clock, the heavy oak front door chimed. I heard heavy, familiar footsteps in the marble foyer. It was my grandfather, Theodore. He walked into the dining room, dripping wet from the rain, and stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at the crooked, cheap birthday banner. He looked at the single, sad little cupcake. Then he looked at me, sitting there in my oversized sweater, trying not to cry. His face fell entirely, a shadow of deep, profound heartbreak crossing his weathered features. He did not yell at my parents. He knew from years of experience that it would not change a single thing about how they operated. Instead, he pulled out the heavy wooden chair right next to me and sat down. He placed a large, warm cardboard box on the table. A massive pepperoni pizza from my favorite local place down the street. "Julian," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite identify at the time. "Where is everyone else? Dad is working on a big deal. Mom is planning Harrison's party," I replied, staring down at my small hands. "It is okay, Grandpa. Harrison going to college is a really big deal. They need to focus on his college fund. It is more important than a birthday." My grandfather reached out and placed his large, calloused hand over mine. He had built his massive construction and development company from the ground up, starting with absolutely nothing but a rusty toolbox and a relentless, unbreakable work ethic. He squeezed my hand gently, grounding me. "Julian, look at me," he commanded softly. I looked up into his kind, deeply lined face. "You are worth more than they will ever see. You have a fire in you, a brilliant mind. Do not let them define you. Do not let their blindness make you feel small. You are going to be incredible." I did not fully grasp the massive weight of his words then, but they became the absolute foundation of my survival. As the years dragged on, the horrible divide in our house only grew wider and more apparent. Harrison was the undisputed golden child. He could do absolutely no wrong. When he crashed his expensive car while driving under the influence at 19, my father paid a small fortune to a defense lawyer to make the charges magically disappear, calling it a minor youthful indiscretion. When Harrison dropped out of college after 3 pathetic semesters because the workload was too stressful, my mother coddled him endlessly, insisting the professors simply did not understand his unique, creative genius. Meanwhile, I existed entirely in the shadows, fighting for scraps of attention. I joined the high school debate team, became the captain, and won state championships. Silence from my parents. I made the high honor roll every single semester. Nothing. The absolute breaking point arrived on my 17th birthday. I had just received my SAT scores in the mail. They were perfect. Flawless. I had essentially secured a full-ride academic scholarship to almost any top-tier university of my choosing. I walked into the massive living room, holding the envelope in my shaking hands, a tiny, foolish, desperate spark of hope burning in my chest. Maybe this time they would look at me. Maybe this time they would be proud. I found them standing proudly by the large bay window, looking out at the circular driveway. Harrison was standing next to a gleaming, midnight blue Porsche. A bright red, obnoxious velvet bow sat on the roof of the luxury car. "Congratulations on getting the assistant manager position at the country club, son," my father boomed loudly, clapping Harrison hard on the shoulder. My mother was literally wiping away tears of joy with a tissue. "We are so incredibly proud of you, Harrison. You have worked so hard for this. An assistant manager job. A job that his father had secretly arranged and paid for him to get. Rewarded with a sports car that cost more than most people's homes." I stood frozen in the doorway, gripping my perfect test scores until the paper crumpled. My mother turned, noticing me for a brief, fleeting second. "Oh, Julian, good you are here. Can you go to the kitchen and make sure the caterers know to bring the extra champagne out to the patio? We are celebrating your brother." I did not argue. I did not yell. The final string tying me to them simply snapped. I just walked back to my bedroom, packed a single, worn duffel bag with my clothes, took the envelope with my test scores, and walked out the back door. I moved into a tiny, cramped, freezing apartment with 2 older roommates. I took a grueling job bussing tables at a dirty diner from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. I took another minimum-wage job shelving books at the university library. I put myself through undergrad entirely alone, and then I put myself through Harvard Law School. I took out massive, suffocating student loans. I worked until my bones physically ached, and I built my life brick by agonizing brick. During those brutal, exhausting years, my grandfather was my one and only anchor. He came to my tiny, awful apartment every single Sunday for breakfast. We ate cheap, boxed pancakes, and he listened to me talk endlessly about constitutional law and civil torts with genuine, wide-eyed fascination. He never once offered to pay my way, and I never once asked him to. He knew I needed to build my own armor. He knew I needed to prove to myself that I could survive without their money. 7 years later, I stood in the grand, historic auditorium at Harvard Law School, wearing my graduation gown. I had graduated in the top 10% of my incredibly competitive class. I had a job lined up at a massive firm with an incredible starting salary. I had sent my parents an elegant invitation months in advance. A pathetic, lingering part of the wounded child inside me still desperately wanted them to show up. When they called my name, the auditorium erupted in applause. I walked proudly across the stage. I looked out into the massive sea of thousands of faces, scanning frantically for my parents. They were not there. But sitting right in the front row, wearing his absolute best tailored suit and holding a small digital camera, was my grandfather. He was beaming with a pride so fierce and pure it brought immediate hot tears to my eyes. When I sat back down in my seat, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket. A text message from my mother. "We don't celebrate mediocrity." 5 words. That was all I was worth to her. Because I was not Harrison. Because I had succeeded without their money, without their influence, and without their permission, I was mediocre to them. I showed the text message to my grandfather later that afternoon over a celebratory coffee. He read it, his jaw tightening so hard I thought his teeth might crack, his eyes hardening with a quiet, terrifying fury. "Julian," he said, handing the phone back to me with a shaking hand. "I raised Victor better than this, or at least I prayed to God I did. I am deeply, profoundly sorry for the immense pain my son has caused you." "It is not your fault, Grandpa," I told him, forcing a smile. "Maybe not," he replied, staring out the cafe window at the bustling street. "But I see clearly what they refuse to see. You did this entirely on your own. That is real success. That is what actually matters in this world. And I promise you, Julian, they will realize their massive mistake when it is far, far too late." I thought the worst was over. I thought the pain of being rejected by my parents was a closed, locked chapter of my past. I was so incredibly wrong. 15 years later, the inevitable, crushing reality of time finally arrived. My grandfather's strong, resilient heart finally began to fail him. He was 85 years old. For 2 grueling, heartbreaking weeks, he lay in a sterile, brightly lit, depressing hospital room in downtown Boston. The constant, rhythmic beeping of his heart monitor became the agonizing soundtrack to my days and nights. I refused to leave his side. I moved my entire legal practice to his bedside. I drafted massive corporate contracts on my laptop while he slept, and when he was awake, I held his frail, incredibly thin hand. I read his favorite classic novels to him. I told him wild stories about my latest courtroom battles, exaggerating the drama of the opposing counsel just to see a weak smile cross his face. My parents showed up exactly once during those entire 2 weeks. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Victor and Beatrice walked into the quiet hospital room looking like they had been severely, personally inconvenienced by having to be there. They stood rigidly at the foot of the bed, refusing to step closer or touch him. Victor complained loudly to the nursing staff about the exorbitant hospital parking garage fees. Beatrice spent the entire 20 minutes scrolling aggressively through her phone, checking her social media, occasionally looking up to ask the weary nurse if there was a definitive timeline on how long these sort of end-of-life things usually take. They did not hold his hand. They did not say they loved him. They did not thank him for everything he had given them. They checked their expensive watches and left without even saying goodbye. My grandfather passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 days later. I was holding his hand tightly when the heart monitor let out that long, devastating flatline sound. The grief was an immediate, crushing physical weight on my chest, knocking the breath completely out of my lungs. I handled every single aspect of the funeral arrangements. I picked out the mahogany casket. I chose the flowers. I wrote the eulogy through blinding tears. My parents stood at the graveside looking like VIP guests at a charity event they did not want to attend, accepting fake condolences from business associates, while Harrison complained loudly about the humidity ruining his suit. 1 week after we put him in the ground, the phone call came from Robert Smith, my grandfather's longtime, highly trusted estate attorney. He requested my immediate presence at his downtown office for the official reading of the will. I assumed it would be a very simple, quick formality. My grandfather was a very wealthy man, but I figured he would leave the vast bulk of his estate to my father, his only child, and perhaps leave me a small trust fund, or maybe just a sentimental heirloom like his vintage watch. I arrived at the sprawling law firm and took a seat on one side of a massive oak conference table. Victor, Beatrice, and Harrison sat on the exact opposite side, looking at me with pure disdain. Harrison was aggressively chewing gum, checking his expensive Rolex watch, looking bored out of his mind. Robert Smith walked into the room, his face incredibly grave and strictly professional. He sat down at the head of the table, adjusted his reading glasses, and opened a thick, sealed manila folder. He cleared his throat loudly. I will skip the standard legal boilerplate and get straight to the distributions, exactly as Mr. Theodore Sullivan explicitly requested. Robert began. He looked down at the heavy parchment document. To my grandson Julian, the only person in this entire family who loved me for who I am, and absolutely not for what I have in my bank accounts, I leave the entirety of my estate. This includes all real estate holdings, all investment portfolios, the 401k accounts, and all liquid assets, totaling approximately $12 million. The large conference room plunged into an absolute, freezing, terrifying silence. I stopped breathing entirely. I stared at Robert, my mind completely refusing to process the massive numbers he had just spoken. What? Victor snapped, leaning forward so fast and so violently that his heavy leather chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Read that again. There must be a mistake. A typo. My father would never do that. There is absolutely no mistake, Victor, Robert replied calmly, closing the folder and folding his hands. Your father was exceedingly clear. He drafted this specific will exactly a year ago with full documented mental capacity. He left explicit, undeniable instructions. Robert slid a single, laminated piece of paper across the polished table. At the bottom, in my grandfather's distinct, sprawling, beautiful handwriting, was a single, devastating sentence. They never came when I needed them. Julian did. Beatrice's face went entirely, shockingly white. Harrison stopped chewing his gum, his mouth hanging open in pure, unadulterated shock. The reality that his endless funding had just been cut off was dawning on him. This is unacceptable, Victor roared, slamming his heavy fist on the table so hard the water glasses rattled. That is my father's money. It belongs to this family, not to this ungrateful, arrogant dropout who abandoned us 15 years ago. I did not abandon you, I said, my voice dangerously low, vibrating with 15 years of suppressed rage. I left because you bought a brand new Porsche for the son who failed out of school, and told the son who got into Harvard to go fetch the champagne. And I am not a dropout, Victor. I am a senior partner at a corporate law firm. You manipulated him, Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the room, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at my face. He was 85 years old. He was confused. You spent all that time at the hospital maliciously poisoning his dying mind against his own family so you could steal his money. I spent time at the hospital because I actually loved him. I fired back, the deep grief and boiling anger finally erupting. Where were you, Mom? Complaining about parking tickets while he was taking his last breaths. You disgust me. I stood up, grabbed my briefcase, walked out of the office, and left them screaming at Robert Smith. I genuinely thought the initial shock would wear off. I thought they would consult a rational lawyer who would look at the documents and tell them they had absolutely no case to contest a watertight will. But I vastly underestimated their boundless greed and their obsession with image. 2 days later, a loud, Violent banging echoed through my quiet apartment. I opened the door to find Victor and Beatrice standing in my hallway, their faces twisted with fury. They pushed past me without an invitation, standing in my living room looking around with absolute disgust. "We are giving you one single chance to fix this monumental mistake," Victor demanded, his face red, a vein pulsing in his forehead. "You will contact Robert tomorrow and sign a document transferring the entire estate to me, where it rightfully belongs. In exchange, I will graciously allow you to keep $500,000. A nice little payout for your troubles. Take it or leave it." I stared at him. The sheer, unadulterated audacity was staggering. "Get out of my apartment," I said coldly, pointing at the door. "You have absolutely no right to that money," Beatrice yelled, stepping toward me. "It is Harrison's inheritance. He needs it to expand his new business venture. You already make a massive lawyer's salary, you selfish prick. It is what family does. We share the wealth. Are you really standing in my home lecturing me about what family does?" I asked, a bitter, dark laugh escaping my throat. "Parents don't abandon their children for 15 years. Parents don't show up only when there is a massive check on the table demanding a cut. The will is 100% legal. If you have a problem with it, take it to court." Victor stepped right into my personal space, his eyes narrowing into venomous, hateful slits. "We will. And we will make sure every single person in the Boston legal and business community knows exactly what kind of manipulative, gold-digging garbage you really are. We will destroy your career, Julian. You will have absolutely nothing." Exactly 1 week later, the process server walked right past the receptionist at my law firm, into my private office, and handed me a thick, heavy manila envelope. The lawsuit. They were officially suing me for undue influence, elder manipulation, and fraudulent misrepresentation. They were demanding the court void the will entirely, reverting the estate to intestate succession laws, which would automatically give Victor everything. But the lawsuit was not the worst part. The worst part was the vicious, calculated smear campaign. Penelope, Harrison's wife, ran a highly connected boutique public relations firm in the city. Within 48 hours of the lawsuit being filed, a devastating article appeared in a prominent local Boston business journal. The headline was a massive, calculated blow. Prominent corporate attorney accused of exploiting dying grandfather for $12 million fortune. The article did not name me directly, but it provided enough specific details about my firm, my age, and my background that anyone in the legal community knew exactly who the article was targeting. The piece painted me as a ruthless vulture who had completely ignored his loving family for over a decade, only to swoop in during an old man's final, dementia-riddled days to maliciously rewrite his will. The professional backlash was immediate and suffocating. I walked into the main break room at my firm the very next morning, and all conversations stopped dead. People looked away, suddenly intensely interested in their shoes. Simon, a senior associate who had always viewed me as a bitter rival for the next major partnership slot, leaned against the expensive espresso machine with a nasty, victorious smirk on his face. "Tough break on the PR front today, Julian," Simon mocked loudly, sipping his coffee so everyone could hear. "Word of advice? If you are going to swindle your own family out of millions, try not to leave such an obvious paper trail. The managing partners are definitely not going to like the stench of elder abuse lingering on their pristine corporate letterhead." I gripped the leather handle of my briefcase until my knuckles turned stark white. My own parents were actively trying to orchestrate my professional and social execution. They wanted me destitute. I turned around, walked straight to the corner office of Clara, one of the sharpest, most ruthless, and brilliant litigation attorneys in the entire city, and a deeply trusted friend. I walked in, shut the door, and dropped the massive 30-page legal complaint directly onto her glass desk. "I need you to represent me," I said, my voice shaking with a dark, terrifying rage I could barely contain. "They want a war. I am going to give them an absolute massacre." The large, glass-walled conference room in Clara's office quickly became our designated war bunker. For 2 exhausting weeks, the massive table was buried completely under mountains of legal documents. Years of medical records, decades of bank statements, phone logs, and deposition transcripts. We worked brutally late into the night, ordering cheap takeout, drinking endless cups of stale coffee, and hunting for every single piece of evidence we could find. We needed airtight, undeniable proof that my grandfather was completely mentally competent at the time of the signing, and that I had never, ever pressured him into changing his will. Clara was meticulous, brilliant, and absolutely ruthless, building a fortress of paper evidence to protect me. But Victor was not playing by the standard rules of civil litigation. He was playing incredibly dirty. One rainy evening, while I was buried in a stack of financial disclosures, my cell phone rang. It was Felix, my younger cousin on my father's side. Felix and I had never been particularly close, but he had always seemed like a decent, normal guy, usually staying far away from the toxic family drama. "Hey, Julian," Felix said, his voice laced with what sounded like deep, genuine sympathy. "Man, I saw that awful article in the journal. I just wanted to call and say I am so incredibly sorry. I know Victor and Beatrice are completely out of their minds with greed. Nobody in the extended family believes that absolute garbage they're peddling to the press." "Thanks, Felix," I sighed heavily, rubbing my tired, bloodshot eyes. "It's an absolute nightmare. They are throwing every single lie at the wall, hoping something sticks with the judge." "It's insane," Felix continued smoothly, his tone conversational. "How are you even defending against that? They keep telling everyone that the medical records from the hospital show he was on heavy painkillers and didn't know what he was signing. The hospital records from his death don't matter at all," I replied, feeling a brief, foolish moment of comfort having a family member seemingly on my side. "We have an independent neurological evaluation from 3 months prior to the will being signed. Plus, I've got George, Grandpa's old personal driver. George was with him every day. George is going to testify that Grandpa was sharp as a tack, and that Victor was constantly harassing him for loans to cover Harrison's debts." "Wow, George is testifying? That's huge," Felix said, sounding impressed. "Well, keep your head up, man. We're all rooting for you." I hung up the phone, feeling a slight, fragile sense of relief. That relief lasted exactly 12 hours. The next morning, Clara walked into the war room, her face completely pale and her eyes blazing with absolute fury. She tossed a piece of paper violently onto the pile of documents. "We just lost our star witness," Clara said, her voice tight with anger. "What, George?" I asked, standing up so fast my chair rolled backward. "I just spoke to him yesterday. He was fully on board and ready to testify. I just got off the phone with him," Clara explained, pacing the room. "George was in absolute tears. Victor called him late last night. Victor threatened to use his old mafia-style influence with the local labor union to permanently strip George of his hard-earned pension and tie him up in frivolous civil litigation until he is completely bankrupt. George is terrified for his family. He backed out. He completely refuses to take the stand." My stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. A cold, sickening realization washed over my entire body. Felix hadn't called to support me. He hadn't called to offer sympathy. He had called to fish for our legal strategy. He had immediately run back to Victor, acting as a spy, feeding him the critical information about George. My own flesh and blood, a man I grew up playing catch with, had acted as a corporate rat to help my parents completely destroy my life. I sat down heavily in the leather chair, staring blankly at the wall. The betrayal stung 1,000 times worse than the lawsuit itself. It was the devastating realization that the deep, toxic rot in my family was not just isolated to my parents and my brother. It infected the entire bloodline. Everyone was for sale. Everyone bowed to Victor's money and intimidation. "Julian," Clara said softly, walking over and putting a firm hand on my shoulder. "I know it hurts. I know this is devastating. But we absolutely cannot let this derail us. They are desperate. Intimidating a key witness proves they know they cannot win on the actual facts. They have unlimited resources, Clara," I said, my voice hollow and defeated. "Victor will buy, threaten, or destroy anyone we put on that stand. They are going to walk into that courtroom next week and paint me as a monster, and without a key witness to corroborate the timeline, it is going to be a brutal battle of he said, she said. And judges hate family drama. Clara stood in silence for a moment. Then, she walked over to her locked, fireproof filing cabinet in the corner of her office. She pulled out a small, heavy black lockbox, keyed in a complex numerical code, and popped it open. She reached inside and pulled out a small, heavily sealed manila envelope. "I was waiting for the right moment to show you this," she said, her eyes intense and burning with a fierce light. "I received this via secure, bonded courier yesterday afternoon directly from Robert Smith, your grandfather's attorney. Your grandfather was a brilliant, incredibly perceptive man, Julian. He knew exactly who his son was. He knew Victor would try to rip this inheritance away from you the second he died. He anticipated this exact, horrible scenario." She handed me the heavy envelope. I broke the thick red wax seal and slid out a standard, silver USB drive. "What is this?" I asked, my heart beginning to hammer wildly in my chest. "Robert Smith had a very strict, legally binding protocol," Clara explained, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If the will was ever legally contested by Victor in a court of law, Robert was strictly instructed to deliver this drive directly to your legal counsel. Your grandfather made this 14 months ago, when his health was still absolutely perfect." I plugged the USB drive into my laptop. The folder opened. There was only one single file inside. A high-definition video file simply labeled Declaration_Theodore Sullivan.mp4. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking slightly, and clicked play. The screen flickered, and suddenly, my grandfather was looking right at me. He was sitting comfortably in Robert's massive office, wearing his favorite worn gray cardigan. He looked healthy, vibrant, and completely, undeniably alert. His bright blue eyes were sharp, clear, and full of life. "My name is Theodore William Sullivan." His voice filled the quiet, tense conference room, strong, deep, and completely unwavering. "I am recording this official statement of my own free will, in the presence of my legal counsel, to explicitly explain the distribution of my estate. And more importantly, to protect my beloved grandson, Julian, from the inevitable, disgusting greed of his father." I stopped breathing. Hot, heavy tears immediately sprang to my eyes and spilled down my cheeks. Seeing him alive, hearing his booming voice defending me, broke the massive dam of emotion I had been holding back for weeks. I sat in silence and watched the video in its entirety. By the time the screen faded to black, I was openly weeping, my face buried deep in my hands, my shoulders shaking. It was the most profound, beautiful act of pure love I had ever witnessed. From beyond the grave, my grandfather had built an absolute, impenetrable shield around me. He had foreseen the betrayal and he had saved me. Clara handed me a box of tissues, her own eyes shining with unshed tears. "This is our nuclear option, Julian. It comes with full, undeniable metadata authentication and a sworn legal affidavit from Robert Smith verifying its creation and chain of custody. It is bulletproof." I wiped my eyes, a new, hardened, terrifying resolve settling deep in my chest. The fear was completely gone. The hurt of Felix's betrayal was gone. All that remained was absolute, icy, calculated determination. "We don't tell them," I said, my voice steadying, growing cold and sharp. "We let them walk into that courtroom. We let them present their vicious lies, their forged narratives, and their fake, dramatic tears. We let them fully commit to their perjury on the public record." Clara smiled, a dangerous, predatory curve of her lips that I knew meant someone was about to lose everything. And then, I said, slowly closing my laptop, "We dropped the bomb. We let my grandfather speak for himself. The storm was finally here, the winds were howling, and I was no longer afraid of the thunder. I was ready to bring the lightning. Let us return to that suffocating, heavily air-conditioned courtroom, right to the exact razor-sharp moment where we left off. The heavy mahogany doors were shut tight, sealing us inside a room where my entire future was about to be violently dissected. Judge Montgomery, a man who had personally mentored me years ago in the trenches of corporate law, was staring down from the high wooden bench with absolute, unvarnished disbelief. He had just realized that the defendant in this horrific elder abuse case, the monster painted in the 30-page legal complaint, was me. My mother, Beatrice, sat at the plaintiff's table. She wore a smug, deeply self-satisfied smirk on her perfectly contoured face. She truly believed that this entire legal proceeding was simply a minor administrative formality. In her incredibly privileged, profoundly deluded mind, she genuinely thought they were just going to walk in, tell a sympathetic judge that I was a terrible, ungrateful son who had strayed from the flock, and effortlessly walk out with a court-ordered check for $12 million. She thought the legal system was just an extension of her local homeowners association, a place where whoever complained the loudest and wore the most expensive jewelry automatically got their way. Winston, their slick, high-priced, incredibly arrogant attorney, stood up slowly and purposefully buttoned his custom-tailored suit jacket. He was a man who made a very lucrative living out of intimidating people and manipulating the truth. He walked right to the center of the polished courtroom floor, projecting his deep, practiced voice loudly so every single reporter sitting eagerly in the back rows could hear every single devastating syllable. "Your Honor," Winston began, his tone dripping with a heavy, manufactured sorrow that made my stomach churn. "My clients, Victor and Beatrice Sullivan, are sitting before you today because of a grave, devastating, and entirely unnatural injustice. Their beloved father, Theodore Sullivan, was a man of considerable wealth, immense community standing, and sound mind for the vast majority of his long, successful life. He was a pillar of the Boston business community. He built a real estate empire with his bare hands. But in his final years, as the brutal reality of aging took its toll, his health rapidly and tragically declined. He became incredibly vulnerable. He became confused, easily led, and desperately lonely. And that is exactly when the defendant, Julian Sullivan, saw an opportunity. He completely and maliciously isolated an old, dying man from his loving family. Winston paused dramatically, letting the heavy, toxic words hang in the stagnant air of the courtroom. He turned on his expensive leather shoes and pointed a stiff, accusatory finger directly at my face. Julian manipulated his grandfather emotionally, psychologically, and financially. Winston continued, his voice rising in righteous, theatrical indignation. He preyed on a dying man's fears. He fed him lies. And when Theodore was at his absolute weakest, lying helpless on his hospital deathbed, heavily medicated and completely unaware of his surroundings, Julian coerced him into disinheriting his own flesh and blood, his only son, Victor, in favor of himself. This is a classic, textbook case of predatory elder abuse, orchestrated by a corporate lawyer who knew exactly how to exploit the legal loopholes to steal a family fortune. I sat perfectly still. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I just stared right back at him, keeping my breathing slow and measured. Clara, my attorney, sat next to me, her posture perfect, her face a completely unreadable mask of professional calm. She was a coiled spring, just waiting for the right moment to strike. Your Honor, to prove this pattern of malicious isolation, I would like to submit Exhibit A into evidence, Winston announced, walking briskly back to his table and picking up a thick stack of printed papers. He handed copies to the bailiff to deliver to the judge, and then he walked over and dropped a copy directly in front of Clara and me. The paper landed with a soft, threatening thud. These are printed records of text messages sent directly between the defendant, Julian Sullivan, and the deceased, Theodore Sullivan, during the last 6 critical months of Theodore's life. I looked down at the pages. They were real text messages. The phone numbers were accurate, but my stomach immediately turned, and a cold flash of pure anger spiked in my chest because I instantly recognized exactly what they had done. If you look closely at these specific exchanges, Your Honor, Winston said smoothly, pacing the floor like a predator circling a wounded animal, you will see a very clear, highly disturbing pattern of behavior. The defendant repeatedly and forcefully discourages his grandfather from seeing his own son. In one message, dated November 12, Julian writes to his grandfather, and I quote verbatim, "You don't have to give him anything. Tell him no." In another message, dated December 3, Julian explicitly instructs the old man, "They just want your money. Don't let them visit." This is not the language of a loving grandson, Your Honor. This is the calculated language of a warden guarding a prisoner. He systematically poisoned the sacred relationship between a loving father and son, built an invisible wall around the old man, and then he swooped in to claim the massive inheritance. The courtroom began to murmur loudly. The reporters in the back rows were furiously scribbling in their notepads, their eyes darting between me and Winston. The carefully constructed narrative was shifting heavily in my parents' favor, and I could physically feel the crushing weight of public judgment in the room pressing down on my shoulders. Suddenly, the heavy wooden chair at the plaintiff's table scraped loudly against the floor. My mother stood up. Winston quickly reached out a hand to stop her, knowing that outbursts were legally dangerous, but Beatrice was entirely addicted to the spotlight. She needed to play the ultimate victim. She needed the audience to look at her. "He convinced Theodore that we didn't love him," my mother cried out, her voice breaking with perfectly manufactured, soap opera emotion. She pressed a pristine white tissue to her completely dry eyes. "Julian never cared about this family. He abandoned us when he was just 17 years old because he was selfish. We gave him everything, and he threw it in our faces. He is a cold, calculated, heartless manipulator. He was a mistake we never should have made, and now he is trying to steal the legacy that rightfully belongs to his brother, Harrison. He is a monster." The entire courtroom froze. The silence was absolute and terrifying. Did she really just say that on the public court record? Did she really just call her own son a mistake in front of a federal judge and a room packed full of journalists? The sheer audacity, the unhinged narcissism of her statement, hung over the room like a dark cloud. Judge Montgomery's face turned a deep, furious shade of crimson. He gripped his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down onto the sounding block so hard the sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. "Mrs. Sullivan, sit down immediately," Judge Montgomery roared, his voice shaking the very walls of the room. "This is a United States court of law, not a daytime television talk show. You will not speak out of turn again. You will not hurl personal insults across my courtroom, or I will have the bailiff physically remove you from these premises and hold you in criminal contempt. Do I make myself absolutely, perfectly clear?" My father grabbed my mother's arm and yanked her forcefully back into her heavy chair. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she looked around the room. Finally realizing that the judge was not one of her country club friends she could manipulate with crocodile tears. She had massively overplayed her hand. But despite the reprimand, the damage was already done. The poisonous, insidious seed of doubt had been planted in the room. Winston looked incredibly pleased with himself, adjusting his tie and hiding a small, victorious smile. "Your Honor, the text messages clearly speak for themselves," Winston said, wrapping up his dramatic, venomous opening statement. "They show a clear, undeniable, and highly documented pattern of malicious isolation and elder exploitation. The defense cannot run from the defendant's own written words." Judge Montgomery looked down at the printed papers, his thick gray brow furrowed deeply. He looked over at me, and for a split second, I saw a genuine flicker of doubt in his intelligent eyes. That was the moment I knew we had to strike. If we waited, the lie would become the accepted truth. Clara stood up slowly, meticulously smoothing the front of her tailored gray skirt. She did not look angry. She did not look flustered. She looked incredibly, terrifyingly bored. And having worked with Clara for years, I knew that was when she was at her absolute most dangerous. "Your Honor," Clara began, her voice crisp, clear, and utterly devoid of any theatrical emotion. The plaintiff's entire legal argument rests completely on the fabricated claim that Mr. Theodore Sullivan was mentally incompetent, and that these highly specific text messages prove a pattern of isolation. But there is a massive, glaring, and frankly illegal problem with Exhibit A. Those messages have been intentionally, maliciously, and deceptively altered by opposing counsel. Winston shot to his feet, his chair flying backward. Objection! That is an outrageous, defamatory accusation to make in this courtroom. It is a verifiable, documented fact. Clara shot back instantly, not missing a single beat, her eyes locking onto Winston with the intensity of a sniper. She turned calmly to the judge. Your Honor, opposing counsel has knowingly submitted cherry-picked, heavily redacted text messages to this court. They have deliberately deleted the surrounding context to entirely change the meaning of the conversations, attempting to commit a fraud upon this court. Clara walked over to our defense table, opened her sleek laptop, and seamlessly connected it to the large digital display screen mounted at the front of the courtroom. We anticipated this exact bad faith tactic, so we subpoenaed the full, unedited, time-stamped cellular records directly from the telecommunications service provider, Clara stated confidently. The giant screen flickered to life. The full, complete text message exchanges appeared in bright, undeniable high definition for every single person in the room to read clearly. Let us closely examine the very first message Mr. Winston read to the court, Clara said, pointing a red laser pointer directly at the massive screen. He boldly claimed that Julian told his grandfather, "You don't have to give him anything. Tell him no." But let us look at the message Theodore Sullivan sent directly before that, which opposing counsel conveniently decided to delete from their exhibit. Clara highlighted the text bubble directly above mine. It was from my grandfather. The screen read, "Victor called again. He is screaming at me over the phone. He wants me to immediately co-sign a massive commercial business loan to bail Harrison out of another bad real estate investment. He says if I don't give him $50,000 by Friday, he won't let me come to the family Thanksgiving dinner. My chest hurts from the stress. I don't know what to do." A collective, highly audible gasp rippled aggressively through the gallery. The reporters completely stopped writing and stared at the screen in absolute shock. The narrative had just shattered into a million pieces. And here is Julian's full, unedited response. Clara continued, her voice echoing loudly in the stunned, breathless silence. The screen showed my reply, "You don't have to give him anything. Tell him no. You cannot let him extort you for a seat at a Thanksgiving dinner, Grandpa. That is emotional and financial abuse. Do not sign that loan. I will come over to your house and make us a turkey myself. We don't need them." Clara turned slowly and looked directly at Winston, who had suddenly gone completely, horrifyingly pale. The smug confidence had completely melted off his face, replaced by sheer panic. "As you can clearly see with your own eyes, Your Honor," Clara said, her voice dripping with absolute, freezing ice. "My client was not isolating his grandfather. My client was actively, desperately protecting an 85-year-old man from being financially extorted and emotionally terrorized by his own son." She confidently clicked the presentation remote to the next slide. "And here is the second message," Clara announced, refusing to give them a single second to recover. Mr. Winston claimed Julian said, "They just want your money. Don't let them visit." Let us read the full, actual context of that heartbreaking day. The massive screen showed another message from my grandfather, dated just weeks before he died. "Beatrice just called my hospital room. She said she is only coming to visit me if I agree to fully pay for Harrison's new country club membership for the year. She said hospitals depress her and she needs an incentive to endure the smell." And my immediate response below it, "They just want your money. Don't let them visit if they are going to hold their presence hostage while you are sick. You don't deserve that. I am leaving the office and on my way to the hospital right now. I will be there in 10 minutes. I love you." I looked over at the plaintiff's table. My father, Victor, was staring down at the polished wood of the table, a dark, furious, humiliating red color creeping rapidly up his thick neck. My mother was completely frozen in her chair, her eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated horror as her own cruel, shallow, disgusting words were projected in massive letters onto a giant screen for the entire city of Boston to see. Her carefully curated, wealthy socialite image was being publicly slaughtered. Judge Montgomery looked absolutely furious. He leaned far over the high bench, glaring down at Winston like a hawk about to strike a field mouse. The air in the room felt dangerously thin. "Mr. Winston," the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet and laced with pure menace, "did you intentionally submit doctored, incomplete evidence to this federal court to deliberately misrepresent the facts of this case and defame the defendant?" Winston was actively stammering, sweating profusely under the harsh courtroom lights, frantically shuffling his papers. "Your Honor, I assure you we received these printouts directly from my clients. We firmly believed they were the complete files. We had absolutely no intention whatsoever to mislead this court. We relied on the plaintiff's representations. He was already throwing my parents directly under the bus to save his own legal license." "Save it," Judge Montgomery snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. He looked over at Clara, his expression softening slightly with respect. "Counselor, do you have anything else to present to this court before I make my final ruling on this absolute travesty of a lawsuit?" Clara looked over at me. I gave her a single, firm, definitive nod. The trap was perfectly set. The bait had been swallowed whole. It was time to completely spring it and end this war. "Yes, Your Honor," Clara said, her voice ringing out clearly. "We have one final, irrefutable piece of evidence that will conclude this matter entirely and prove the absolute malicious intent of the plaintiffs." I thought the worst was over. I thought the pain was behind me, but the final nail in their coffin was about to be hammered in by a ghost. The courtroom was completely, utterly silent, vibrating with a tense, incredibly heavy anticipation that you could practically cut with a knife. Winston sat down heavily at his table, frantically whispering aggressively to Victor, desperately trying to do some kind of legal damage control. But there was absolutely no controlling the hurricane that was about to hit them. "Your Honor," Clara said, standing incredibly tall and projecting absolute, unwavering confidence. "The plaintiffs have repeatedly, aggressively claimed in their filings that Theodore Sullivan was suffering from severe cognitive decline. They have repeatedly claimed he was heavily manipulated. They have claimed he did not understand the contents of his own last will and testament when he signed it." Clara walked slowly, deliberately back to our defense table and picked up the small, unassuming silver USB drive from her briefcase. She held it up so the judge could see it clearly. "We have undeniable, conclusive evidence that perfectly demonstrates Mr. Theodore Sullivan's complete mental capacity, his sharp intellect, and his exact, uncoerced intentions regarding his estate," Clara stated loudly. Winston jumped to his feet again, pure panic completely taking over his normally composed features. "Objection! Your Honor, what evidence? We were not provided with any such digital media during the discovery phase. This is trial by ambush. Because it was held in a secure, legally mandated, heavily encrypted escrow by the deceased estate attorney, Robert Smith, specifically to prevent you and your clients from suppressing it or destroying it," Clara fired back effortlessly, completely shutting him down. She turned her attention back to the judge. "Your Honor, we have a high-definition video recording, made by Mr. Sullivan himself, exactly 14 months before his tragic death. In this video, he explicitly explains his final decisions in his own exact words." The courtroom erupted into frantic whispers. The reporters were leaning forward over the wooden benches. My mother's head snapped up, her eyes darting nervously toward the giant screen. "A video recording?" Judge Montgomery asked, leaning back in his chair, highly intrigued by this development. "Objection!" Winston shouted again, his voice actually cracking slightly in his desperation. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular and legally dubious. In the modern age of artificial intelligence, this video could easily have been manipulated, heavily edited, or entirely fabricated. Deepfakes are rampant in today's society. We fully anticipated that exact, desperate, bad faith argument from opposing counsel, Your Honor," Clara said smoothly, completely unbothered by his shouting. which is precisely why I have already submitted the full, comprehensive forensic digital analysis directly to the court clerk this morning. The video file includes verified metadata, tamper-proof blockchain timestamps, and it was recorded in the physical, documented presence of a licensed, bonded attorney who has provided a sworn, notarized affidavit attesting to its 100% authenticity. Furthermore, Mr. Sullivan underwent a full, rigorous cognitive evaluation by his board-certified neurologist the very same week this was recorded, a medical report which we have also submitted to the court. Judge Montgomery spent several tense minutes meticulously reviewing the thick stack of authentication paperwork the clerk had handed him. He flipped through the pages, reading the sworn affidavits and the doctor's neurological assessment. Finally, he nodded slowly. "The authentication documents are perfectly in order," Judge Montgomery ruled, his voice leaving no room for argument. "The medical records clearly indicate total cognitive clarity. Mr. Winston, your objection is completely overruled. You may play the video for the court, counselor." Clara plugged the USB drive directly into the court's high-tech presentation system. The harsh fluorescent lights in the courtroom dimmed slightly. My parents sat incredibly, painfully rigid at their table. My mother's hands were clasped so tightly together in her lap that her knuckles were stark white and shaking. My father kept nervously, repeatedly glancing between the massive blank screen and the heavy exit doors at the back of the room, looking exactly like a trapped animal desperately searching for an escape route. The massive screen flickered to life, and suddenly there he was, my grandfather. He was sitting comfortably in the familiar leather chair in Robert Smith's massive office, wearing his favorite, slightly worn gray cardigan. He looked incredibly healthy, vibrant, and completely, undeniably alert. His bright blue eyes were sharp, clear, and full of intense life. Just seeing his face again, larger than life on that screen, made my chest ache with a profound, overwhelming grief. "My name is Theodore William Sullivan." His strong, steady, commanding voice filled the completely silent courtroom, echoing off the walls. "I am making this official video declaration today to explicitly, undeniably explain my final decisions regarding my estate, and to permanently protect my beloved grandson, Julian, from the inevitable, disgusting greed of his father." Winston practically sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He knew his career was taking a massive hit today. He knew it was entirely over. "I know my son, Victor, and my daughter-in-law, Beatrice, will immediately try to challenge my last will and testament," my grandfather said on the recording, leaning slightly forward toward the camera lens, his expression hardening. "They are incredibly predictable people. They will probably hire an expensive, ruthless lawyer. They will lie under oath and say I was confused, or sick, or that Julian maliciously manipulated me. So, let me be absolutely, perfectly, legally clear for the court right now." He paused, taking a deep, heavy breath, collecting his thoughts. "I am 84 years old as of the date of this recording. I have absolutely all of my mental faculties. My mind is as sharp as it was when I was 40. I am making this financial decision with full, total, uncoerced awareness. My son, Victor, is a greedy, completely self-absorbed, toxic man who only calls me when he desperately needs money to cover up his own massive financial failures and terrible business investments. My daughter-in-law, Beatrice, cares about absolutely nothing but her shallow social status at the country club and the price tags on her clothing. They have completely ruined and raised my oldest grandson, Harrison, to be exactly like them, entitled, lazy, completely useless, and cruel." A woman sitting in the second row of the gallery actually gasped out loud, slapping her hand over her mouth. My mother completely buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as her entire reputation was publicly incinerated by a dead man. Julian, on the other hand, my grandfather continued, his harsh tone completely melting away, replaced by a warm, incredibly tender, loving smile that broke my heart all over again, was pushed out of this family when he was just a boy because he refused to conform to their toxic, shallow standards. Julian built his incredible life entirely from scratch. He put himself through Harvard. He visits me every single Sunday without fail. He makes me breakfast, He sits and tells me about his life and his career. He has never, not once in his entire 32 years on this earth, asked me for a single solitary dollar. I felt the hot, heavy tears streaming rapidly down my face, dropping onto my expensive suit. I didn't bother wiping them away. I didn't care who saw me cry. I am leaving absolutely everything I own, every single penny, to Julian, my grandfather stated firmly, his voice echoing with absolute, undeniable finality. Because he is the only person in this entire family who actually loved me for who I am. He deserves this inheritance. He earned it through years of genuine, unwavering, unconditional care and love. If Victor tries to drag my grandson into court, I want the presiding judge to know, without a shadow of a doubt, that Victor is acting entirely out of malice, spite, and unadulterated greed. This is my final word on this earth. The video ended. The giant screen faded to a stark, dark black. The courtroom was so quiet you could have literally heard a pin drop onto the carpet. I looked out at the gallery. Several people, including a few of the hardened, cynical reporters who had come for a juicy scandal, were actively wiping tears from their eyes. My father was staring blankly at the floor, absolutely destroyed. His reputation in the business community, his carefully curated public image, everything he valued 1,000,000 times more than his own son, had just been completely, utterly incinerated on the permanent public record. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. Now, let us get back to the final, devastating ruling. Judge Montgomery took off his reading glasses and looked down at the plaintiff's table with an expression of pure, unadulterated, absolute disgust. He looked at Victor and Beatrice like they were something foul he had scraped off the bottom of his shoe. "Mr. Winston," the judge said, his voice dangerously low, practically a growl, "do you have any actual, legitimate, non-fabricated evidence to present to this court? Or are we completely done wasting the taxpayers' valuable time with this completely baseless, frivolous, insulting charade?" Winston stood up slowly, his slick, arrogant confidence entirely, completely gone. He looked defeated. "No, Your Honor. The plaintiffs rest their case." "Good," Judge Montgomery said sharply. He picked up his heavy gavel. "I have proudly presided over probate and estate disputes for 20 years in this city. I have seen families torn apart by tragic misunderstandings and genuine grief. But this case is completely different. This case is driven purely by spite, unbelievable greed, and a staggering, horrifying lack of basic human decency." He leaned forward, looking directly into my parents' terrified eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, the evidence presented in this case is absolutely, undeniably unambiguous. Your father took extraordinary, highly intelligent, meticulous steps to completely document his final decision because he knew exactly what kind of ruthless people you were. The will is 100% valid. The challenge is entirely dismissed with extreme prejudice." The gallery erupted into loud applause. My colleagues from the law firm who had come to watch the proceedings stood up and clapped enthusiastically. But Judge Montgomery raised his hand high in the air, demanding absolute silence. He was not finished with them yet. "Furthermore," the judge continued, his voice booming over the large room, silencing the crowd instantly, "I find that this lawsuit was filed maliciously, in incredibly bad faith, and without a single shred of credible evidence. The plaintiffs intentionally submitted altered documents to this federal court, which borders on perjury. Therefore, I am legally ordering Victor and Beatrice Sullivan to personally pay all of Julian Sullivan's legal fees in the total amount of $45,000, due in full within 30 days. My father flinched violently, as if he had been physically struck across the face. "And finally," Judge Montgomery said, looking right at me with a soft, deeply respectful nod, "given the highly toxic nature of these proceedings and the verified, mafia-style threats made to potential witnesses by the plaintiffs. I am issuing a formal, permanent restraining order. Victor, Beatrice, and Harrison Sullivan are strictly, permanently prohibited from contacting Julian Sullivan in any way, shape, or form. Not by phone, not by email, and not in person. If you violate this legal order, you will be immediately held in criminal contempt and you will go straight to jail. Case closed. The gavel came down with a final, massive crack. It was over. I had won. But the real destruction of their lives was only just beginning. The immediate aftermath of the trial was a chaotic, dizzying blur of absolute madness. The moment the judge dismissed the court, reporters rushed the aisles, shoving microphones forward, desperately trying to get quotes and sound bites. My colleagues from the firm completely surrounded me, shaking my hand vigorously and patting my back in triumph. Clara hugged me fiercely, telling me over the loud noise how incredibly proud she was of my resilience. But I couldn't breathe. I desperately needed air. I packed up my briefcase with shaking hands, pushed my way through the heavy wooden doors, and walked out into the long, echoey, marble hallway of the courthouse. That is exactly when I saw her. My mother, Beatrice, was standing completely alone by the massive steel elevators. Winston and my father had already rushed ahead, practically sprinting out of the building, likely trying to furiously figure out how to handle the massive, career-ending public relations nightmare currently waiting for them outside the courthouse steps. She was just standing there, staring blankly, emptily at the cold marble wall. Her carefully, expensively applied makeup was completely ruined, smeared in dark, ugly tracks running rapidly down her pale, drawn cheeks. She looked 20 years older, broken, and completely hollowed out than she had when she confidently strutted into the room that morning. For a brief, fleeting second, I heavily considered just walking right past her. I considered ignoring her the exact same way she had callously ignored me on my lonely 10th birthday, the same way she had ignored me on my graduation day, and for the last 15 agonizing years of my life. But I stopped. My feet felt glued to the floor. "Mom," I said quietly, the word tasting completely foreign in my mouth. She slowly turned around. Her eyes were completely hollow, devoid of any warmth. "What do you want, Julian?" she asked, her voice a raspy, broken, bitter whisper. "Are you here to gloat? Are you finally happy now? You just completely, utterly humiliated us in front of the entire city. You took absolutely everything. You have officially lost your family today." I looked at her. I really, truly looked at her, searching the depths of her eyes for any tiny, microscopic ounce of maternal love, any shred of genuine regret or realization of her horrible mistakes. There was absolutely nothing there. She was an empty vessel of vanity. She actually believed her own twisted delusions. She truly believed that family was entirely about blood, obligation, and strict financial control. "I didn't take anything," I said, my voice incredibly calm, completely and totally devoid of any lingering anger. "Grandpa gave it to me. There is a massive, fundamental difference. And as for losing my family, you are completely wrong." She glared at me, aggressively defensive to the very bitter end. "We are still your parents, Julian. We gave you life. You owe us your respect." "No," I replied, shaking my head slowly, feeling a massive weight lifting off my shoulders. "You are just the two biological people who gave birth to me. But you were never, ever my parents. Real parents fiercely protect their children. Real parents show up for birthdays. Real parents love you unconditionally, even when you choose a different path than they planned for you. You did absolutely none of that. I never had a family, Mom. I just shared a large house with incredibly selfish people who desperately wanted Grandpa's money. That is not the same thing. Not even close." Her face completely crumpled. For a fraction of a second, I thought she might actually apologize. I thought the heavy, crushing weight of her massive, lifelong failures might finally break through her fragile ego. Instead, she hardened her jaw, lifted her chin in a pathetic display of defiance, and hissed venomously, "We will never, ever forgive you for this." I am not asking for your forgiveness, I said, turning away, feeling completely free for the first time in my life. I am just asking you to stay away from me forever. I walked onto the open elevator, the heavy metal doors sliding shut, leaving her standing entirely, completely alone in the cold hallway. That was the absolute last time I ever spoke to my mother. Fast forward 3 months. The incredibly tight-knit, wealthy commercial business community in Boston is a surprisingly small world, and scandalous word travels incredibly fast. The public release of the court transcripts, detailing the maliciously altered text messages and my grandfather's damning, brutally honest video, completely and irreparably destroyed Victor's professional reputation. In high-end commercial real estate, your word, your perceived integrity, and your handshake are absolutely everything. Once the local business journals published the truth about the trial, it was a bloodbath. Within mere weeks, Victor's firm lost 3 massive, multi-million-dollar development contracts. Huge corporate investors aggressively pulled their funding out, explicitly citing strict corporate morality clauses and refusing to do business with an exposed elder abuser. His company went into a severe financial tailspin. But the absolute most satisfying poetic twist of karmic fate came a few weeks later regarding Harrison, the deeply beloved, constantly coddled golden child. It turned out that Harrison's luxurious, incredibly wealthy lifestyle was a complete, elaborate, entirely fraudulent house of cards. He was massively, overwhelmingly in debt. The new business venture he desperately needed my inheritance for was actually a frantic, pathetic attempt to pay off massive illegal gambling debts and incredibly predatory, high-interest business loans he had taken out in secret. One Tuesday morning, exactly at 8 a.m., a heavy, loud commercial tow truck pulled directly into the pristine, perfectly manicured circular driveway of my parents' massive suburban estate. While the entire wealthy neighborhood watched through their plantation shutters, sipping their morning coffee, the aggressive repo men hooked heavy chains up to Harrison's beloved, midnight blue Porsche. They towed it right down the street, the tires squealing on the pavement. It was officially repossessed by the bank. The luxury car, the ultimate symbol of his unearned, fraudulent golden child status, was completely gone, and the humiliation was entirely public. My mother, the woman who cared 1,000,000 times more about her public image than absolutely anything else in the world, became a total social pariah. The wealthy, judgmental women in her elite country club, the snobby women at the local HOA meetings, completely and ruthlessly ostracized her. No one wanted to be publicly associated with a woman who had been viciously reprimanded by a federal judge for trying to extort and ruin her own son. She started skipping the expensive charity galas. She was forced to start grocery shopping at a Walmart 3 towns over just to desperately avoid the loud, whispered gossip in the local grocery store aisles. They had tried to completely destroy my life, to strip me of my dignity and my career, and in the end, their own disgusting greed had burned their perfectly curated, fake facade entirely to the ground. They were left with absolutely nothing but their own toxic misery. As for me, I did exactly what my grandfather wanted me to do. I lived my life fully, and I finally found genuine, profound, unbreakable peace. I didn't need $12 million sitting in a bank account. I had a highly successful job, a fantastic corporate salary, and an incredibly comfortable life that I had painstakingly built with my own 2 hands through years of grueling hard work. The massive inheritance was 1,000,000 times more money than I could ever possibly spend on myself in a single lifetime. But I knew exactly what Theodore Sullivan would have wanted me to do with his massive, hard-earned legacy. A month after the trial ended, I sat down in a large conference room with Clara and my team of wealth management financial advisors. I want to set up a permanent, fully endowed scholarship fund, I told them, sliding a thick proposal across the table. I want to name it the Theodore Sullivan Memorial Fund. I want to aggressively allocate $2 million to start this initiative. I want this scholarship to go specifically and exclusively to law students from severely low-income backgrounds. Students who have absolutely no safety net. Students who have to work 3 exhausting jobs just to pay for incredibly expensive textbooks. Students who know exactly what it means to fiercely fight for their education because absolutely no one else is ever going to hand it to them. Clara smiled, an incredibly warm, genuine, beautiful smile. Julian, that is absolutely brilliant. It is beautiful. Your grandfather would be incredibly, overwhelmingly proud of the man you have become. We rapidly established the massive fund through my old law school alma mater. When the university's press release went out to the public, it completely solidified my grandfather's legacy in the city. He was no longer known as the victim of a greedy, abusive family. He was known as a generous, brilliant, loving man who was now actively helping the next generation of desperate fighters achieve their dreams. With a small, modest portion of the remaining funds, I finally bought myself a permanent home. I did not buy anything crazy and nothing overly flashy. I did not buy a massive, cold, modern mansion or an obnoxious, loud sports car to show off. I bought a beautiful, historic, deeply charming Victorian house in a quiet, heavily tree-lined neighborhood. It has a large, welcoming wraparound porch where I drink my coffee every morning, a massive, floor-to-ceiling library for my extensive collection of law books, and a huge, warm kitchen where I can finally cook massive Thanksgiving dinners for the people who actually, truly matter in my life. I surrounded myself completely with my chosen family, brilliant friends, supportive colleagues, and incredible mentors who respect me deeply, support my ambitions, and love me for exactly who I am, not for what I can provide them. Looking back at the entire exhausting nightmare, the brutal years of childhood neglect, the horrible, agonizing betrayal of my cousin Felix, and the vicious, completely baseless lawsuit, I realized something incredibly, profoundly important about the long journey of healing. For the absolute longest time, I foolishly thought that setting boundaries meant being a cruel, unforgiving person. I was deeply, psychologically conditioned by society and manipulated by my toxic parents to believe that you must always unconditionally forgive your family, no matter how terribly, abusively they treat you. I truly thought that cutting people off meant I was the bad guy in the story. But I was completely, utterly wrong. Boundaries are absolutely not about being cruel. Boundaries are entirely about protecting your own sacred peace. They are about having the immense courage to look at yourself in the mirror and say, I am a good person. I deserve basic human respect, dignity, and kindness. And if you cannot give me that bare minimum, then you absolutely do not get to have any access to my life. My parents never respected me. They saw me as a massive, frustrating disappointment simply because I fiercely refused to play their toxic, superficial, wealth-obsessed games. I spent decades silently, desperately hoping they would magically change, praying they would finally open their eyes and see my immense worth. But the hard truth is, you cannot ever earn love from broken people who view love as a simple, cold financial transaction. My grandfather taught me what real, pure, unconditional love looks like. He fiercely believed in me when I had absolutely nothing to my name but a cheap duffel bag and a perfect test score. He saw my fire when my parents only saw a burden. And because of his unwavering support, I finally learned how to fiercely, unapologetically believe in myself. That was the true, priceless inheritance he left me. The $12 million was just paper and numbers in a bank account. The validation, the undeniable, concrete proof that I was truly worthy of love and fierce protection, was the real, lasting gift. If you are watching this video right now, and you are sitting in a similar, incredibly painful situation, if you are the designated scapegoat of your completely dysfunctional family, if you have toxic parents or cruel siblings who constantly belittle you, emotionally drain you, or treat you like you are completely invisible until they need a favor, I need you to hear me loud and clear. You do not owe anyone access to your life just because you happen to share the same DNA. You do not owe anyone your precious emotional energy, your hard-earned money, or your mental sanity. Setting firm, unbreakable boundaries is not an act of selfishness. It is the ultimate, most beautiful act of self-respect. You deserve absolute, unwavering peace. You deserve to be surrounded by incredible people who loudly celebrate your victories, not miserable people who actively, secretly plot your downfall. Do not ever let toxic family members guilt-trip you into accepting unacceptable, abusive behavior. You have the power to walk away and build a life that is entirely yours. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to bravely stand up in court, or simply stand up in your own living room, and permanently cut off the people who were supposed to love you the most? Share your incredible story in the comments below, and please don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey we take together. Remember, you are so much stronger than the pain they caused you, and your peace is absolutely worth fighting for every single day.